Hello, today we're going to talk a little bit about symbolism. Now, symbolism is when an object or action represents some sort of deeper meaning. So we see symbols all around us. Things like hearts symbolize love. You might see a cross symbolizing Christianity or Christ or even salvation. But all of these concrete objects will represent an idea or perhaps another person. And they're found not just in the world around us, but all throughout literature. And we're going to look at how you can analyze symbolism on a deeper level using a symbolism chart. And we're going to do this with the Scarlet Ibis. So we've already kind of talked about these two things. We've talked about the Scarlet Ibis itself, and we've talked about the storm in the end of the story. Well, we knew already that the Scarlet Ibis had a lot in common with our character Doodle, and that's because it symbolizes Doodle. So let's start by looking at that Scarlet Ibis and comparing it to what it symbolizes, or Doodle. When you're trying to deepen a symbol, so you're looking at not just the Scarlet Ibis represents Doodle, but you want to see like what it has to reveal about Doodle, what you're going to do is you're going to examine the symbol's role in a couple different ways. So first, look at descriptions of the Scarlet Ibis throughout the story. Fill some of those in your chart. Second, you'll look at the role it has in the story, or perhaps the actions that it does or surrounds it. And then last but not least, you're going to look at characters' attitudes towards it, or characters' responses towards it. By doing this, we're going to get a deeper picture of not just the symbol itself, but what it has to tell us. So I'm going to start with some descriptions. When I think about the Scarlet Ibis, well, first off, I know that it's red. I also know that it has an issue with its wings. It seems like something is broken with its wings. It's sick. But I also know things like the descriptions of it frequently include that it is beautiful or graceful. So we have the sense of beauty as well. So I have a few physical things about it. I can even mention like where it is. It's found in the bleeding tree. And again, I can also include things like it came from far away. But that's already getting into kind of the roles and actions that it does. So it came from far away. In fact, it came from the tropics. And it's driven by a storm there. And we notice that what happens is it falls out of a tree, the bleeding tree, and then dies. So that's given us a few roles and actions, things that it does, but we still have to talk about the character's responses. Now we really have two main responses. We have the narrator and his family, so the narrator and the parents, and they respond kind of jokingly. So they joke a little bit. They more or less ignore it after it dies. It's not super important to them. And that's in direct contrast to Doodle. Now, Doodle here is going to respond instead by burying the bird. And when he does so, you also see a lot of sorrow from him. So we can kind of include both of those. And notice I'm not really worrying about my spelling. I'm not really worried about that at this point because this is pre-writing. This is what you do before you write any sort of formal paper. So mistakes are okay. Now that I have this kind of figured out, what I'll do is I'll start figuring out how this connects to Doodle. Now, sometimes you might not actually know what a symbol stands for. If we didn't know that this stood for Doodle, what I do is I kind of run through this and say, well, what does this remind me of? And what else plays a similar role in the story where it is ignored maybe by the family, where it is driven by a storm, maybe something that falls and dies. metaphorically or symbolically what things have similar attributes and roles in the story. And what you should come up with asking yourself about this is doodle. Doodle has a lot in common. And don't worry too much if you can't figure out how one or two of those connect. You'll develop it as you work out the smaller details. So let's start with red. Now, while the Scarlet Ibis is red just because it is a red bird, Doodle is described as red in two different instances. He is actually described as red and wrinkled when he's born. But I'm guessing that what you thought about right away was the final scene where we see Doodle covered in blood, his own blood. In fact, if you look at that final death, you'll notice that it actually looks a ton like the bird's death. Doodle's neck is described as extraordinarily long looking, which is how the Scarlet Ibis is described. His legs are described as thin, like the Scarlet Ibis's, and a lot of the positioning is actually really similar. And that's because the author wants to make sure that you really notice the connection between these two, and he's very good at what he does. But we have more things to consider. The Scarlet Ibis has broken wings and is sick. Well, we know that Doodle also suffers from illness, so he's sick frequently. And we also know that while he doesn't have broken wings, he has trouble walking, even after he learns. He doesn't have the strength of the other boys. And so that ties very directly to the broken wings. However, the bird is described as beautiful. And this is where you're going to get some more insights into Doodle. We don't get descriptions of Doodle being physically beautiful. However, if you think about Doodle, Doodle is a beautiful person. Doodle is kind. He is imaginative. And even though he doesn't seem to quite fit in, just like this bird doesn't fit in, you can see that he's very loving and loyal. And all of these things make him beautiful. And all of these things also make it so he doesn't quite belong. Just like the bird doesn't belong because he came from the tropics. But what we do see is not only does he not belong, it's not in a bad way, because this bird itself, even though it doesn't fit where it ultimately ends up, it's still described as good and beautiful. So this not belonging isn't necessarily a bad thing. However, it does lead to his death. And if you think about Doodle himself, this not belonging leads to his death because it pushes him too far. He tries very hard to belong with his brother, and that ultimately kills him. So you can note that with this leading to death and explain how this not belonging can bring him there. And notice how many insights you can get from even a single element. When we get to driven by storm, don't forget that storm is a symbol as well. We found that the storm symbolizes the narrator's pride. Which means that while we can say Doodle did run from a physical storm, which is true, and it's something that he has in common with his symbol, Doodle is also running from a symbolic storm. He runs due to the narrator's pride. So here he's driven or pushed to advance based on his brother's pride. And we know that what that results in is this failure. When the bird falls out of the tree and dies, that's very much like what happens to Doodle. Doodle does not succeed. Doodle can't run in the end. And he dies. It maybe should have been something he was able to do, just like a bird coming out of a tree typically results in the bird just flying. Ultimately, it's too much for him. And that really leads to his physical end, just like the bird's physical end. But we still kind of have to look at how the other characters view him. The narrators and the parents joke and almost ignore the Scarlet Ibis. And that same thing can be seen in their treatment of Doodle. They don't take him very seriously. And at times they even say that they stopped listening to him because he talked so much. And you can see almost a lack of respect and a lack of expectations. Maybe not from the part of the brother, but from the part of the parents. And it's not necessarily out of cruelty or dislike, but more out of just this indifference and this ignoring of the bird's death. There are a lot of other things you can draw out here, but we're going to look at Doodle's response. Doodle, however, in contrast to them, buries the ibis, and he's sorrowful. When you have a character responding with the thing that symbolizes them, a lot of times you're going to see how they view themselves, but you also might see how they wish others viewed them. Doodle here treats the ibis with respect, and he feels a great deal of sorrow. And you can see then some sorrow for his own situation, but you can also see that he wishes others would treat him this way. He wishes others would respect him. And you can see that he knows the value of even this broken bird. He knows the value that he has. And that loss, that death, is still serious to him. And that's one way you can deepen a symbol. Again, make sure that you address each of these. Don't get too caught up with descriptions, which often will only lead to surface level combinations between a symbol and what it represents. And don't only do what it does, but also look at those characters' responses. I want you guys to then do your own table. And for this table, look up information on the storm and see how it symbolizes the narrator's pride. I want you to be sure that you do at least one for each of the 3 things I asked you to look for. So do at least one. And you should fill up at least 6 blanks in total. So I have 2 extra. We'll maybe get some from your classmates to add to those 2 blanks. But do at least 6 things and explain how they show you more about the narrator's pride. You can get most of them from memory, but it actually can lead to a lot of really great insights if you go and reread the part with the storm, because you'll notice details that you would have overlooked when you weren't focusing on the storm, but were instead focusing on the main events of the story. So that is what it will be due tomorrow. If you are stuck at home, go ahead and take a picture of your chart or just type up your chart online and submit that onto Classroom under today's assignment. If you will be back tomorrow, you can turn it in person. Let me know if you have any questions.